talking today with Roger Bouma of Caledonia, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Roger, start off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Okay, I was born here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, so I'm a native here and pretty much lived a lot of my life here. When I was going to school, I went to Grand Rapids Christian and Calvin College and Seminary and became an ordained minister in 1987.
All right. And what year were you born?
1960.
Okay. So you grew up with Vietnam on television, that kind of thing. What impression did you have of the military or things military as you were kind of going through high school, college?
The only real impressions I had was what I saw on TV. I saw the protests, I saw the violence, and so I was kind of an outside observer. I didn't know anyone who was in Vietnam at the time. None of my family was in that particular war. So it was, the impressions that I had were on TV, what I saw.
Okay. Now, does your family have any kind of military background?
Yes, I do. I have an uncle who taught at the Naval Academy for 37 years, and he's the one who introduced me to the possibility of going into the Navy. So at the time I was a pastor of a church in South Haven, Michigan, and then he took me to the cathedral of the Navy, and that kind of got me hooked into the idea of joining the Navy, and so I did in 1992.
All right. And what spurred you to do that at that point in time?
Well, I was always interested in chaplaincy. I did a residency at Pine Rest Hospital here in Grand Rapids as a chaplain. So my expertise is really in hospital chaplaincy, working with people in oncology, surgery, drug rehabilitation. And so I knew I was interested in chaplaincy. I wasn't so sure I was interested in the military, but my uncle got me interested, and so I checked out the possibility, and the Navy welcomed me with open arms.
Okay. And how did you wind up actually going into the Navy in particular rather than a different service branch?
Well, I applied to different ones. I applied to the Air Force, I applied to the Army, it was open to it, but the Navy was welcomed me with open arms. I say that because there's a lot of background checks that have to be done. The process took a little longer than I thought, even as a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. So finally it got done, and then I came active duty in April of 1992.
Okay. So once they accept you, is there a training course you go through, or what do you get next?
Yes, there is. There's a training course called Officer Indoctrination School. That happens in Newport, Rhode Island. That's where they train physicians, lawyers, nurses, and chaplains. And so it's an 8-week course. You have a gunnery sergeant in the Marine Corps who teaches you how to march, how to wear the uniform, how to salute, how to run military etiquette, and then the Navy hires you as in your expertise as a minister. So I already knew that, because that's why it's important that ministers have pastoral experience before they enter the Navy, because that's what the Navy, the Marines, and the Coast Guard expect you to do.
Okay, so you do that 8 weeks, and then what happens to you?
Then you talk to the detailer and get your first assignment. So you can talk to the detailer ahead of time, and they give you sometimes choices, sometimes not. So we had a very challenging assignment. We went right from Newport, Rhode Island to Guam, which a lot of people don't know where it is. If you fly to California, then you fly to Hawaii, and then it's an 8-hour flight the other side of Hawaii, basically on the other side of the world, but of strategic importance to the military.
Okay, and then, now did your family go with you?
Yes, my family did go with me. There was some real big hoops for that to happen to make sure there was housing, but fortunately my denomination has an apartment that we could rent on the island, so which allowed us to go at the last minute. And they did join us in housing, but I was assigned to a ship in Guam, the U.S.S White Plains, which was a supply ship. So the understanding was my family would be in Guam, but I would be out on the ship very soon.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, just describe the White Plains. It's a supply ship. How big is it? What's it look like?
It's an interesting ship. I would describe it as a floating refrigerator. So basically, it is a logistics supply ship. It has 5 holds going down. It was about 600 feet and had about 500 personnel.
Okay.
So in order to have a chaplain, usually a ship would have to have about 450 to 500 to rate having a chaplain. And we supplied aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk and the Abraham Lincoln with food. So we would go alongside the aircraft carrier, supply them with eggs, chicken, food that they needed. So while a nuclear aircraft carrier can subsist for many months at sea because of its nuclear capability, it could subsist only very short time, very few days without supplies.
At least to have fresh food.
Yes. Fresh fruits, or FF&V, fresh fruits and vegetables is what we would get.
Okay. I think you had mentioned something. So you're not giving them their eggs? Someone else does that? Or did you give that too?
That was our assignment to do that. And we would do that through a rotation of 2 helicopters that were assigned to our ship and an air crew of HC-46, which are twin-bladed helicopters, and they're heavy lift, and so they could lift the heavy pallets and deliver them on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier. And then we would also go alongside and have connected replenishment through lines that we would deliver those pallets. So it's quite an operation to deliver pallets alongside, and then with a helicopter as quickly as possible so the aircraft carrier can resume flight operations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And would weather conditions interfere with that?
Yes, yes, they would. You can't do it in rough seas because the draft in between 2 ships going at 15 knots alongside each other is greater, so you cannot have too many waves. Although we can deliver in some adverse conditions.
Okay. Now, you're in that assignment in the mid-90s, and that's sort of between wars, if you will, but there are also areas where there are things happening or military gets deployed for peacekeeping missions or other things like that.
Yes.
While you were based in Guam, did your group do any of that?
Yes, we were involved in several operations right away. We were in Restore Hope, Somalia, so we were off the coast of Africa, supplying ships there. While the action was going on, we could see the action on the shore, but we stayed offshore, and we'd go in and out of port, getting those fresh fruits and vegetables, and then giving them to that battle group. And then we're drawn up to Operation Desert Storm. So I was in Operation, that was the first time I was in Iraq, supplying the Lincoln Battle Group for what they needed in their operations there.
Okay. Now, the Desert Storm, the official fighting per se was in 91, right?
Well, it went to...
But we were there.
Yes.
For quite a while after that.
Yes. So officially we were part of the operation. It was in 1993 we were.
Because there's still no fly zones going. We still have a large military presence in the Gulf at that point. Because we never really left. But
Right. Never really left after that.
All right. Now, did you actually go physically into Iraq at that point, or
No,
did you stay offshore?
I did not. But what we would do as chaplains, we have a program in the Navy called Project Hand Clasp. So whenever we embarked, the chaplain would request, we have pallets of materials, medical supplies. So we would visit several countries on the way there, like India, Malaysia, China, and then we would do projects in those community relations projects as chaplains at orphanages in Thailand and Australia to help out those countries along the way, and that way promote good faith as chaplains, and sailors would volunteer for these projects as well.
Okay. And how were you received in these different places?
Very well. It's a moving experience to go into an orphanage in Thailand and to see the conditions that some of the countries have, and to help those little kids that gave purpose to the sailors, and also kept them out of trouble on liberty because they wanted to help those little kids, and it gave them a tremendous sense of purpose.
Okay. So when you're on board ship and you're sailing around these places and delivering supplies and so forth, day to day, what are your duties as a chaplain like?
My job is I directly report to the commanding officer, so I work for him or her to provide, to keep him or her up to speed about the morale and how things are going on the ship, where there are problems, but also to provide religious ministry and support to sailors by conducting worship services and providing confidential counseling. And that's one thing that chaplains have that's very valuable. We have complete confidentiality. So if my CO asks me, well, what did you talk to Seaman Jones about? That is something that Seaman Jones owns under the Privacy Act. So that's very valuable. When people feel like they have someone they can talk to, they talk to me about their problems, about their families. And also I liaison with the families back home by writing a newsletter for the commanding officer through the Ombudsman program, which would be a newsletter monthly the CO would put out to the head ombudsman back at home, and they would distribute it to the family members and support them there.
Okay. And if somebody is coming to you with a particular problem or issue, I mean, are there situations where you can help them beyond the level of just counseling? I mean, can you get anything done for them?
Sure, I can help them with emergency leave. I can help them with a humanitarian transfer if they have an issue with an immediate family member. I can work with the ombudsman if they give me permission to help that family member get help. If they have financial problems, we have the Fleet and Family Support Center. And so I have a lot of tools that I can use confidentially to help that sailor. Of course, there are certain situations you just can't help a sailor. We're out on a ship, nothing's going to change, but the fact that they can talk to someone relieves a lot of the stress and helps them morale, helps the mission get done better so they can concentrate on their job and do their job, which is what they're there to do in the first place.
Okay. And I guess sometimes there can be sort of conflicts between people of one kind or another,
Sure.
or lower ranking people being mistreated by those above them in various ways and so forth. And
Sure.
sometimes, particularly when you have women on board larger ships,
Yes.
there can be serious issues.
Sure.
And so forth. And so if somebody comes to you and they confide something like that, this person did X to me or whatever, as a chaplain, what range of things can you do?
So I have the free range to visit that workspace to formulate my own opinion about what's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people are just blowing smoke and they're trying to manipulate me to manipulate the command.
Mm-hmm.
So I get my own impression, and then ultimately I can tell the executive officer and CEO, say, hey, there's a problem in the engineering department down there. You need to look into it, and work with the command master chief, the senior enlisted sailor as well, because they have a lot of power through the enlisted ranks and the chief's mess.
Okay. What were the most common kinds of issues you had to deal with?
Usually it would involve marital issues. Sometimes lonely sailors also, though, in a foreign port, meet someone and they want to get married, and they do so on the spur of the moment because they're lonely. That person seems like a very loving person, so I would have to deal with them on that.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, I come from a faith group that requires a lot of premarital counseling to making such a life-changing
Mm-hmm.
decision like getting married. And so a lot of sailors would want to marry someone in Thailand, or someone who's Guamanian, or someone they met.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would have to try and talk with them about whether that's the best decision that they could make.
And then presumably, on the other hand, there's also sort of marital problems and issues and things where
Sure. There's a rumor in the Navy that if you serve a long time like I did, you either lose your family or your career. That's not necessarily true. If you enter the Navy and you have a strong marriage, strong relationship, you can have a strong career and have a strong Navy career. If you have one that's not so strong, then it can deteriorate. Because one thing that we all need in marriage is trust. If you're gone for 6 or 7 months on a ship, you need to be able to trust your spouse, man or woman, that they take care of things where they are, and similarly trust you out on liberty that you're making responsible decisions and are trustworthy as well.
Okay. So in that 5-year span when you're based out of Guam, how many different countries do you think you visited?
Probably about 20. Another thing I failed to mention, that I'm supposed to try and keep the morale up of the ship, so I would work with the morale, welfare, and recreation. I was a tours officer, so every time if we came into Singapore, when we came into Thailand, I arranged the tours that the sailors would go on. In Australia, collected the money. My chaplain assistant would collect the money and then arrange that they would go on the tour, and which was good. And they also, on Sunday afternoon, they would often, if you're at sea, do what they call Seal Beach Picnic, where you get grills out on the flight deck and rock bands playing music and having a good time and doing that, and also do talent shows to show off the talent. I would arrange for people to do everything from magic acts to hypnosis on the flight deck.
All right. And out of the various places that you went, I mean, which ones particularly stand out for you?
Well, one particularly stands out is when we pulled into Madras, India, and we asked to do a community relations project, and we did a relations project with a home run by the Catholic nuns for children who were born with AIDS. So in the Hindu society, or in the Indian society, children who are born with AIDS are outcasts. So their parents, their mothers leave them often, and the orphanage takes care of them. And so we would go and interact with the children because the society sees them as outcasts, so they would be they're afraid that they would catch AIDS through being touched. So being able to be with the kids and play with them was a very meaningful experience. And eventually they would contract the disease themselves, so where they would die maybe at 10 or 12 years old. And the children were wise to this, but it was a very meaningful experience for both myself and the sailors who went.
All right. And so you have, and in that 5 years there, you had kids at that time?
Yes, I have one older son. Older, he was only like 4 or 5 at the time. And then I have another son who was born in Guam at Guam Naval Hospital. So he's Guamanian. And the Navy has a wonderful recruiting program called, where they allow family members to go on the ship. So I took my son who was born in Guam back to Guam, where we flew, and I showed him the house where we lived, where the hospital where he was born, and he actually got to ride the John S. McCain, famous ship, back from Guam back to Japan, where it was home ported. And so he fired weapons, 50 cals, Mike, and lived in first class berthing, which he thought was really cool. And I had a son that did that twice. They have fond memories of that.
Okay. All right. So now when you joined the Navy, what was the official length of commitment when you went in?
Additionally, first it was 3 years. and I joined as a lieutenant JG for 6 months, but had reconstructive time. After 6 months, I was a lieutenant, and then you're a lieutenant for a long time, and then after 3 years, you decide to apply for augmentation to regular Navy. So I enjoyed it, so I augmented to the regular Navy and was accepted, and then stayed on from there.
Okay. So you're making that transition while you're in Guam, or
Yes.
based out of Guam anyway.
Yes.
Okay. And now, when that 5-year stint in Guam is over, what do you do next?
Well, I went right from there to Parris Island with a Marine Corps boot camp. So Navy chaplains serve with the Navy, they serve with the Marines, and they serve with the Coast Guard. So we're the only corps that wears 3 uniforms, basically. So there's a little bit of training that goes with that, because the Marine Corps functions on a similar structure that the Army functions, which is very different from the Navy, although they have similar function. They have different terminology. So I went to a Fleet Marine Force school to learn the Marine Corps terminology and how to wear the Marine uniform and function with the Marine Corps as a chaplain.
Now, did you have to do any kind of physical training with the Marines, or?
Well, if you want to be respected, you need to run with them. So I quickly earned my Fleet Marine Force ribbon. So you have to run, instead of a mile and a half, you run 3 miles. You have to do pull-ups and you have to do push-ups. So pull-ups are hard to do. So my Marine Gunnery Sergeant, I said, how can I learn how to do more pull-ups? He said, well, do more pull-ups. So I did well, though, because I was a kind of a runner when I was there. So I quickly adapted, and I quickly ran with a battalion right there with the CO, and they really appreciated that.
Okay. And how long did you stay at Parris Island?
3 years with the Second Recruit Training Battalion. So I worked for a 05 lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps, but I think I earned the respect of the Marines and really enjoyed working with the Marines. They appreciate their chaplains, and they don't ask Marine chaplains to do a lot of collateral duties. You're the tours officer, you're the educational officer, you're all these other things. They expect you to be a minister or a chaplain first, and so a lot of chaplains find that refreshing so much that they pattern their career after the Marine Corps.
Okay. Of course, at Parris Island, you've got something that is primarily a training center, and so you'd probably have an organized system and a lot of routine and people whose job it was to do a lot of these other things.
Yes.
Now, were you ministering primarily to the trainees or to the permanent staff on the base, or?
Effective chaplain is ministering to both. So if you take care of a recruit, you take care of a recruit. If you take care of a drill instructor, you take care of 1,000 recruits because you're providing for them. And so I was in 2nd Battalion. 1st Battalion is Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta Company. I was with Echo, Golf, Hotel, so I had 4 training companies. They're each headed by a captain in the Marine Corps. And so they're each at different phases of training. So I could be running an initial physical fitness test with this one, and the other one could be graduating. So I would work with all 4 training companies in their phases of training through the Crucible, which is a capstone event for recruits, but also with the drill instructors. They would have very long hours. They often had divorce and problems. Matter of fact, we had a dramatic experience where a drill instructor in our battalion had a DUI, his 3rd, and he had an incident where he checked out a weapon and shot himself in front of recruits in the combat pool, which was very traumatic event for the staff and for the recruits as well.
All right. Now, for the recruits, what kinds of issues did you deal with?
There's a variety of issues that were reoccurring. Homesicknesses. I made a mistake. I had a better job at home. My family needs me at home. Often second thoughts about joining the Marine Corps, because the Marine Corps views itself, and it probably is a lot more rigorous than the Navy. I was at Marine Corps boot camp and Navy boot camp. Marine Corps boot camp is 12 weeks, so it's a lot more rigorous, and they have a pretty high attrition rate as well. So I would also help the training company by identifying people that just aren't going to cut it. People who say that they're suicidal, they may hurt themselves, and so I would refer them to the mental health unit, and they would make the final decision from there. Parris Island is a self-contained, perfect for boot camp, because it is an island, as it says, and you're stuck on that island unless you're going to wade through mud, alligators, water moccasins, but they're easy identifiable. Someone with a wet pair of camis in Beaufort, South Carolina, so they're easily identifiable.
Now, were you able to kind of help a lot of them work through the jitters and kind of stay with it? I mean, was that more common than having them leave, or?
Yes, and I had a particular technique that my predecessor told me about. He said often he would call the families with their permission ahead of time about if their family could support them. So they're very limited on phone calls. They only get a phone call to say that they arrived and tell them when to come to graduation. But the chaplain we have a leisure to help that recruit make another phone call. And if I felt there was a strong family relationship who would support them, I put them on the phone. Their family said, hey, you made a commitment, you got to stay with it. And that was 9 out of 10 times a very successful thing to do. So they would go out, they'd be ready to train, and the drill instructors thought I was a miracle worker, because they were returning to training and motivated again.
Okay, all right. Are there other particular incidents from that stint at Parris Island that kind of stand out in your memory?
Yeah, there are also tragic circumstances, the one I described with the sergeant who suicided, but also recruits sometimes would do that. I had discovered a recruit who had hung himself. So when the corpsman and I came on, 2 corpsmen came on the scene immediately after that recruit had hung himself. The junior corpsman froze, so I took over the CPR for that recruit, and that was very traumatic experience. We did revive him, but for 5 days, and then he succumbed to his injuries.
Okay, all right. And so it was 3 years in that
3 years.
job. Okay,
Yes.
and then where do you go next?
I stayed with the Marine Corps, but I went over, stayed in Beaufort. There's a Marine Corps air station, so I worked with FA-18 pilots. The Marine Corps has FA-18 pilots that land on aircraft carriers. So on an aircraft carrier, you would have several Navy squadrons, and then you would have a Marine squadron, which would integrate when they deploy. So I had 6 squadrons, and the nice thing about that is 2 of the squadrons were D squadrons, which means they're 2-seaters. So at that time, chaplains could become backseat qualified, which I jumped on that, and so I became backseat qualified as a weapon system officer. So I had about 10 Hornet rides in the FA-18D.
Okay, and were you stationed there when 9/11 happened?
No, I was in Japan when 9/11 happened. It was after that when it happened.
Okay, so how long was the stint then?
Just about a little less than 2 years.
Okay.
2 years or so.
All right. Other particular things that you remember about working with that squadron?
Well, we would often work with Marines. Sometimes there were crashes of airplanes, and sometimes Marines would get into trouble when they come back from Liberty. What was interesting is I would tank with the squadrons when they would go for their unit deployment plan to Iwakuni, Japan. So I would ride on the KC-10 or KC-135. We would tank to California and watch the mid-air refueling. Then we would fly to Hawaii. Then we would fly to Wake Island. And then we would fly to Japan. And so I'd ride the Air Force plane and be with the pilots. And then before they were to return from Iwakuni or the aircraft carrier, we would embark on the aircraft carrier or go to Japan and talk with the pilots when they're getting ready to come back. And sometimes they would confide with me as a chaplain. It takes a little bit of challenge because pilots are a tough nut to crack because they have a little braggadocio. Mm-hmm. So I got an in with them because I would beat them in foosball because I'm had a few talents that way in the ready room. So I got a reputation that I was someone to be reckoned with in the ready room. So I also went to Kosovo at that time with the Marine Corps.
Okay.
I was in Tazar, Hungary when they flew missions into Kosovo. However, because they did not have flyover rights for Turkey, the sorties, they flew about 1,000 sorties, dropping bombs. So they would fly over the Black Sea, they would refuel, drop their bombs, refuel, and then come back. It was about a 10-hour mission for them.
In the Black Sea?
Black Sea.
Why were you in the Black Sea?
Oh, maybe...
well, because Kosovo's off the Adriatic.
Adriatic Sea.
There you go.
Sorry.
You wouldn't need Turkey for that.
That's right. Yeah, so it was... the Marines were excited to be in actual missions where they would do what they were training to do. And so it was exciting time being with them during that time.
Okay. All right. And then sort of, now, are you along the way, I mean, are you getting additional training programs that you're picking up, or?
Yes, chaplains are required to go to a yearly training, and that's identified by the Chief of Chaplains. We have a dual chain of command. We have a two-star admiral in the Navy who's a chaplain we report to, and they determine what the training that is needed for the military chaplains at that time. And then there are training events. I was also a financial training person. I would help Marines and sailors with their finances, investments, things like that, because financial problems are a big problem and a big reason for divorce.
All right. And so, and when do you go to Japan? At least
we went in 2000.
Okay.
And so that was when 9/11 happened, and that really changed the military, all branches of the military from then on. When the trade towers fell, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I got a call from my chaplain assistant. He said, "Chaps, you need to get into the office." And so we went in there, and our Commodore told us we're going to be haze gray and underway from now on, and the military will never be the same. And it wasn't. I was given basically a week to prepare my family. We were in housing already, which I was a lieutenant commander then, so I got better housing than some of the other people. So I got them settled, but it was tough because security was very tight. Delta security, which was the highest security. And so basically got them settled, and then I went underway with the Kitty Hawk, and then from there I rode the 7 ships. I was assigned to a destroyer squadron. Destroyer Squadron 15 is the only forward deployed Navy destroyer squadron. So I had 7 ships I was a chaplain for, about 2,500 sailors on 7 different ships.
All right, so how does that work?
It doesn't. It's challenging because I would ride where most of the ships I was responsible for would be. So if there were 3 destroyers going in this battle group, it would make logical sense, since there's most sailors on that group, to ride with them, or a ship that's going into harm's way would ride that ship. And since I was on the Commodore's staff, I was treated very well because the commanding officer would want a good fitness report from the Commodore. So they would treat me I often rode in the Commodore's at-sea cabin because the Commodore would be aboard the aircraft carrier. And there's really no need for me there because there's 4 chaplains on board an aircraft carrier. So I would ride from ship to ship, providing counseling on ships which were involved in tactics like launching missiles and providing support to the carrier battle group. I would go from ship to ship. They call it the Holy Helo. So on Sundays, I would ride from ship to ship with my chaplain assistant, work with operations to provide for me to get to the different ships and provide counseling. I would set up counseling and work with the executive officer and CEO to provide for their sailors. And that would also involve setting up community relations projects, once again, when you go into different ports and doing projects for those countries where we would visit.
Okay. Now, initially, were you supporting operations in Afghanistan? Because that starts at the end of 2001, and I guess we start moving things into the Gulf in '02. The actual invasion of Iraq is not until '03, but sort of
Right.
What were you supporting, I guess?
We were supporting Iraq missions, Operation Enduring Freedom. Specifically, the ship I was on, the John S. McCain, fired 39 Tomahawk missiles into Iraq in support of special operations. And the U.S.S. O'Brien, I think they fired 3 at that time. And so it was a very tense situation. We had embedded reporters on board these ships to observe what was going on, and it was a very intense time. We had a lot of coalition ships in the Gulf of Hormuz. I think we had 167 ships, so quite a few. It's important not to hit each other when you're getting set to do those kind of operations.
Okay, all right. And were there places where you would go ashore?
Yeah, sometimes we would, as a reward for being 6 months at sea, the Navy allows visits to different ports. Sometimes it was Thailand, sometimes it was Australia. We would go there. So I think I've been to Australia about 10 times. Perth, Australia, Sydney, Australia, which is nice for sailors because they do speak English there. It's a lot easier. So I would arrange tours in these different places for the sailors to go on, and cultural relations projects at orphanages, and set up tours as well.
Okay. And would you put into any of the sort of the Gulf ports or ones in the Middle East?
Yes, we would often go in and out of Dubai. The first time I was in Dubai, when I was in Guam, you could do tours in Dubai. There's carpet buying, there's cultural sites to visit, and so I would set that up. But the second time I was there, it was more confined, so there were activities that sailors could do in Dubai, which is a very, very large port. Some people call it the 8th wonder of the world. It is a huge port. And so they would have activities on the shore there for sailors to do, clubs to visit. Anywhere there's money to be made, you know, there are places there that will take sailors' money and entertain them.
All right. Now, when you're serving in a time frame when there's military activity going on and things like that, I mean, are you paying attention basically to what's happening and trying to stay on top of events?
Yes. I think chaplains are trying to keep the big picture of what's going on with the ship and what the ship is participating in, what operation, and how things are going. Do things seem to be going smoothly? And the CEO would want to know that. Where are there problems? And then sometimes I would be asked to go on a ship that I was not familiar with to provide services where there's some problems. And so I would be thrown into ships, which is okay. Military Sea Lift Command ships where there are civilians serving. You have to be adaptable to adapt to any situation, a ship you're unfamiliar with, and you learn to adapt.
All right. What kinds of things are the most challenging?
Most challenging is when there's a problem at the highest level with the chain of command, where a CO has a problem. See, someone who is a commander in charge, there's a progression as far as people who are career officers. If they get to be a CO of a destroyer, then eventually they want to become a CO of a deep draft, which is their path to admiral. But there are some situations where I had to tell the Commodore, this person is abusive and they should not command a cruiser, and they should not be screened for at-sea command.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big step for an officer. If they become a department head, then they want to be an executive officer.
Mm-hmm.
Then they want to be screened, and after they're executive officer, they want to screen for at-sea command.
Mm-hmm.
If they make it at-sea command, they do well, then they can go farther up as far as they can go.
Okay. And a chaplain has some influence over that process?
Sure, because my Commodore would always ask me, what do you think about that CO? Because since I had 7 ships, they all had to be ranked.
Mm-hmm.
This commander is number 1 of my 7 commanders. And so I'm just an additional sounding point for that
Mm-hmm.
Commodore to decide which one is best and which one is the least effective. And that's it. That's their that's a responsibility.
Okay. How would you assess the overall quality of these officers that you're working with?
I think in general they're screened very well. By the time someone screens for to be a commanding officer of a ship, they've gone through several wickets, which screens them out pretty well. They also go through training, officer training, commanding officer training, where they know how to use chaplains, they know how to effectively deal with morale issues. They're very aware of all the tools that are at their command to make sure that they have a best chance at a successful career.
Okay. So the system as a whole functions pretty well?
Functions pretty well. It has for over 200 years. Changed quite a lot, but generally the people that rise to the top are probably the best and most qualified people to do the job.
Okay. Now, how long was your stint being based in Japan?
Japan was 3 years, and then the Navy sent me to graduate school for a year.
Okay.
I did a residency at Portsmouth Naval Hospital, training with people who were drug rehab, surgery, oncology, and also ICU. So that's kind of my specialized training, and then I got tagged as a pastoral counselor after that.
Okay. And what does
For 1 year.
Okay. And what does a pastoral counselor do?
Well, there are certain jobs that are tagged as for that specialty, and one of them was my next assignment. I was supposed to do a payback assignment in the Bureau of Naval Medicine as a hospital chaplain. However, I was tagged by a senior officer instead to go to Great Lakes basic training as the second in command chaplain at Great Lakes, which is a large training base. It's the quarterdeck of the enlisted Navy. Mm-hmm. Anybody who's enlisted who joins the Navy goes through Great Lakes for their boot camp. And that was due a long time ago to some senators who were on the Armed Services Committee who decided that boot camp should not be in San Diego, it should not be in Orlando, it should be in Great Lakes. So I was given no choice to go there, and served 3 years there at boot camp. We started a new thing. The Marine Corps started a thing called the Crucible, which is a 54-hour event that a recruit has to do. They have to march 48 miles in 3 days on 2 MREs before they graduate. So because the Marines took the lead on that, the Navy decided they needed something too, so they started a thing called Battle Station. So I was part of implementing that in the Navy. So if you happen to visit Great Lakes Naval Training Center, RTC, Recruit Training Command, they have a 2/3 scale destroyer inside the building. And then before the recruits graduate, all hell breaks loose. They go on board the ship, missile hits the ship, they have to save the ship. It's a reproduction of a ship that was hit in Yemen. The mess deck looks pretty much the same, so they put through a variety of scenarios, and that was designed in conjunction with Pixar Studios to make it very realistic. And then when they get through that, then they have a ceremony like the Marines have, where they lose their recruit ball cap and they get a Navy ball cap, and it's a symbol of their transition from recruit to sailor.
Mm-hmm.
The Marine Corps has drill instructors. The Navy has RDC, Recruit Division Commanders, who function in the same way. They're a top 10% of the Navy get to be selected for that.
Okay. And how does that Navy boot camp, how did that compare with what the Marines were doing at Parris Island?
The Marine Corps is much arduous. Of course, the Marine Corps is a lot smaller. They have 180,000. We have about 330,000. So the sheer size is a lot bigger at Great Lakes. We throughput from 39,000 to 45,000 recruits every year. So we need all the chaplains. We have a lot of chaplains there. We had 9. So I was in charge of they call them the ship's chaplain, because the barracks are named for ships and they kind of function like ships, so they get recruits used to the idea of what it's like to function on the ship. They report aboard, and the Great Lakes weather is not the best, so it's pretty much self-contained. They have a chow hall in there in between the 2 barracks, which are called ships, and so they learn the functionality, and they don't have to march too far.
Mm-hmm. All right. Do the recruits have the same kinds of problems that the Marines did?
People are people wherever they are. Yeah, so the recruits in the Navy do have a lot of the similar homesickness, I made a mistake, and so we function very closely. I'm really good friends with the head of the recruit evaluation unit. They have a team of psychologists and counselors which determine whether, but when I started out in the Navy, chaplains were the ones discerning whether someone was suicidal or not.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately that now has changed, where the medical unit is the one who should decide that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the purview of chaplains to decide someone's psychological, that's not my lane. So fortunately, they have an automatic referral process where they're referred, and is a pretty efficient system, pretty much.
Okay, so you did. Okay, and the other thing is you talked about the Marine drill instructors and the kinds of issues they have. Now, are the Navy instructors a different group, kind of socially or in terms of issues they have?
They're pretty much the same thing. They have a pretty intense RDC school that they have to go through, and there's a high dropout rate. They have to go through much more rigorous, just like there's a drill instructor school in Parris Island and San Diego. And so they have to go through a pretty rigorous, and I was a chaplain for RDC school, so I'd run with them, with the division commanders, do the PT with them, and support them in what they're going through. Not all of them make it. And then also celebrate with them. where the drill instructors wear a Smokey Bear cover, the RDCs in the Navy wear a red rope. So that identifies them as a RDC, as a person of authority, and that person will get their division and be responsible for somewhere between 80 and 100 recruits during their 8-week boot camp time. Hopefully see them through to graduation.
Okay. And you had described this group earlier as being sort of, the top people or the best one. Is this an assignment that career enlisted personnel want to have?
It is a career enhanced, it's almost I don't want to say a guarantee of their promotion, but it is certainly as desirable as a C assignment, having a successful C assignment. The problem in Great Lakes, however, being in North Chicago, that the housing and the school system is not the best. So there's an old Army fort south of Great Lakes called Fort Sheridan. So there's still some residual housing down there that's much more desirable, because that were some of the issues, because the school system in Lake Forest is much better in Highland Park, because it's top in the country. So that's where they would desire to live if they had kids of school age.
Yeah, because North Chicago is farther up towards Waukegan and places like that.
Waukegan.
Yeah, that is not as prosperous as
Not as
those
prosperous,
north
and if you have
suburbs.
kids, if you're officer, you probably would send them to private school. Sometimes they had no choice but to send them to the school if they could. Private education is pretty expensive.
Yeah. All right. So what dates were you at that assignment?
Well, I was there for 3 years, but I served the entirety of my last 15 years of my career in Great Lakes.
Okay.
I took different jobs.
All right.
So my family was comfortable. We had bought a house. The Navy gives you a housing allowance, and so you can use that for your house. And so we were comfortable there, so I did everything I could to stay there. So I jumped across the street. The Navy also has A schools, so after they graduate, they can get specialty training. And the school I was at was the largest A school that the Navy has, is Corpsman School. Because we train corpsmen in the Navy, about 5,000 a year, to work with the Marine Corps and serve as assistants to physicians. So that was interesting. I worked for the Bureau of Naval Medicine like I did when I did my graduate school. So that was an interesting assignment, working with corpsmen. Your commanding officer is a doctor or dentist or medical service corps, which is different. So it's a different community the Navy has. For 4 years I worked there. I extended 1 year working with corpsmen and corpsmen instructors.
Okay. And were your duties essentially the same as they had been in other places, or were there distinctive things about this group or this assignment?
It is a distinctive group because the Bureau of Naval Medicine is a particular track that's distinct. So that was part of our chain of command. However, the duties were the same: confidential counseling, helping them through corpsman school, helping them to get through, and so they can serve the Navy and fulfill their enlistment in the Navy. A lot of recruits who join the Navy, they do fulfill their enlistment, and then they decide to use their GI Bill and get out and go to school, which is fine. And the Navy even has a program where you can get out early if you get accepted by a college. You can get out early and have your GI Bill. But the counseling level was really hard for one chaplain and one chaplain assistant to provide for. So I set up a office next to mine for a family service center counselor. So, it wasted time on the Navy's part for sailors to walk over to the family service center and talk to a social worker. So I put the social worker right there, so they didn't have to go anywhere. So my chaplain assistant arranged appointments for the social worker right there, and they had their own office, and it worked out pretty well, I think, during that time. Now, the Navy did a BRAC move, base realignment and closure. They did a study, and they decided to move corpsman school from Great Lakes to San Antonio, where it's part of a enlisted training center where medics for the Army and Air Force are trained, co-located there now. but at that time it was in Great Lakes. And then after extending 1 year at Great Lakes, for 4 years I served there, then I was asked to do an augmentee assignment. I was promoted to commander at that time. I was augmented to the Army for 1 year.
Okay. And what did the Army have you do?
I was a chaplain, but interestingly enough, I was a Navy chaplain, but you wear the Army uniform. The only distinguishing thing was I had a U.S. Navy tag, which was an Army tag, but it said U.S. Navy. And it was an interesting job because I was assigned to the world's largest embassy, which is in Baghdad. It's a 4-mile square complex and has a lot of the amenities to keep people occupied for the State Department. And being a chaplain assigned there, I was assigned to interview minority religions to advise the commanding general on how things were going with the fledgling economy and new system of government they were setting up.
Okay. And when were you there?
2010 to 2011.
Okay. And what was the larger situation in Iraq at that time? Was it relatively quiet, or had the ISIS stuff started yet?
No,
or?
it wasn't quiet. There were still, it was dangerous commuting. I would commute from the base near Othel Palace to the embassy, back and forth in convoy, and there's always danger. Whenever we would interview someone in the embassy, they would be escorted in a vehicle, and there are several gates that they would have to pass through, bomb sniffing dogs, and before they could come in, and we would interview them inside the embassy and then write up a storyboard for the commanding general. General Austin at that time was the commanding general for Operation Enduring Freedom, and he looked to his chaplain for advisement about how things were going with it. There are more generals than I've ever seen in my entire life, and 32 generals in the complex where I worked. 4-star on down.
All right. And so what was your kind of day-to-day job there?
Well, I would set up the interviews, and I would work with a translator assigned to the chaplain's office to write up the slide, conduct the interview, write it up in such a way that would effectively, accurately reflect what the Iraqi citizens were seeing. They were setting up a representative form of government. So the government would be represented by so many women, minority Christians, Kurds, and other minority were supposed to be represented in the government. And it was an experiment. I'm not sure how well it turned out.
Okay. And were you talking to the people who were supposed to be working with the government or in it? Or
Yeah, who were supposed to be represented in the government. They were supposed to get so much money to function in their lane. And so the general said, well, how is it going, chaplain? How are things going? And it was very interesting working with different religions. The Army actually has world religion chaplains, and they're trained. They have a lot more chaplains than the Navy, about 600 more. So they would actually have world religion chaplains. I was thrown into that situation. Although we are supposed to be cultural experts to give warnings about things you do and don't do in different cultures. I had another job in Iraq, and that was to write up hero tributes for soldiers that had died. So at the end of every briefing, which would be on closed circuit TV, I would design a hero tribute to a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine who had passed away in the line of duty, and we had several every week.
All right. And were these mostly from IEDs or things like that?
Usually IED, explosive force projectiles, even people in an MRAP, which is a heavily armored vehicle. Sometimes there were attacks against them which would take their life. Sometimes people could suicide. That happens because you not only have regular Army assigned to Iraq, you have a lot of National Guard, and National Guard don't have the same training as regular Army. So you have USD North, they have a commanding general who is National Guard. West, where Anbar province is, and in the south, and they all have issues. So we would also have a chaplain update brief, and I was responsible. I could, through closed circuit, secure circuit, I would design a brief for all the chaplains all over Iraq. I would have a weekly how goes it with them, and talk about what's going on with them. And interestingly enough, when you're in a combat situation, there are monies available to help with the morale. So toward the last part of my year there, I was assigned with a Christian music singer to escort him all over Nineveh and all over to conduct concerts for different chapels all over the place. Which is kind of interesting. It's during the sandstorm season. It's not a good time for helicopters to fly. So fortunately, someone who's invitee of the commanding general, he has a letter that says he's the equivalent of a commanding general. So he has high privileges. He doesn't get bumped unless there's a real emergency on a helicopter. What bumps him is sandstorms, which you can't fly in those.
All right. And did you get much of a chance? I mean, as you worked with individual Iraqis and so forth in interviewing them. I mean, did you kind of get out into the community much at all, or are you mostly kind of confined to the bases?
No, you're pretty much combined. Fortunately, as I said, Baghdad is 4 mile. They have swimming pools. So, but if you go outside to play tennis, you do it at your own peril, because sometimes from El Sadr, they would launch rockets in the general direction. And interestingly enough, Ugandan guards were hired to guard the embassy, and they would provide security. Many of them were Christians. So it's interesting talking to the guards around the embassy at that time.
Now, were there a lot of civilian contractors going in and out?
Many contractors. It was desirable because a contractor can make a pretty good wage working for the State Department. My problem is they could be gone from their family for a long time. They could make tax-free pay because it's a combat zone. So they can do very well financially, but then there might be a trade-off with your family who's back at home. You haven't seen them in 6 months, a year, even 5 years. I talked to contractors who were there for 5 years.
Okay. Now, the contractors would have been outside of your official purview, or did chaplains do anything for them?
You are the chaplain at the embassy, so if there's a problem, working with the State Department is an interesting experience, and it was a learning experience working with them, because they're not quite sure what to do with a chaplain sometimes. But they know that you function in that capacity, but so you interact with them, help them when you can. A lot of times chaplains make observations about things, so you might see things in a particular way that's valuable to them, but there's not a regular place for you in the State Department as a chaplain.
Okay. And did you have a general sense of how things were going in Iraq while you were there? I mean, was there progress being made towards something, or was it hard to tell?
They're trying to make progress to having a representative government, but I think it's hard with the Shia Islamic influence and the Sunni. They don't seem to get along too well, so it was an experiment. I'm not sure how well it worked. History is still telling that story.
Okay. And then what And so you have a year there. Then what other kinds of jobs did you have at Great Lakes before you retired out of there?
After my year, I transitioned back and I went to the naval station. So that was a more traditional garrison job where my commanding officer was to provide for all the buildings and support to the base. And that was kind of an interesting job to have, because then I could just work with the 35,000 civilians that work in Great Lakes and work with them as well as the sailors that work there. It's on the shore of Lake Michigan, and it's quite a large base. It was started in 1911, so that's when the first recruit walked across the parade deck, walked up from Indiana, and joined the Navy, and so it has a proud tradition of over, 100 years, so it's been around for a long time. The buildings are historic, and it's still working with the Navy, although it's interesting working for the shore side. I've been at sea a lot, I've been out with the Marines a lot, so it's interesting. My CO would say, well, at least I don't have bombs and weapons being fired at me, so I should be thankful, So we provide logistic support for the Chicago area. In the Chicago area, there's many Navy organizations, many veterans. So often I would coordinate for when a sailor dies on active duty, even if they're out in the Pacific, if their parents live in that area, a Navy officer or assigned person has to go and tell that parent that their son or daughter had died, and they need a chaplain to go with them. That's part of the instruction to provide casualty and assistance calls. So I worked with the CACO, or the Casualty Assistance Calls Officer, to make those calls, all the way up to Wisconsin, all the way down to South Chicago, which is a large area to cover. And we also have the Coast Guard chaplain there, so we supported the Coast Guard when they needed a chaplain to do that. And the Marine Corps unit that is there at Great Lakes. We had 59 commands, from recruiting command to several reserve commands in the area, and everybody wants a chaplain for ceremonies. Veterans Day, Memorial Day, wreaths across America. A veteran dies, they want a chaplain to speak at their memorial service. So there's just more need than there is personnel to fulfill it. So even though it was a garrison assignment, had a lot of activity. I also did the budgets for the chapels and had to decide, hire different chaplains, civilian contractor chaplains, rabbis, imams, people who played music for the chapel recruit services. And budget was getting smaller at the time, so it's hard to hire someone if you don't pay them what they're worth. So that was a challenge as well. Writing government contracts, I learned how to do that.
All right, so they did keep you busy.
I'm very busy.
All right, and how is it that you wind up leaving the Navy?
Well, as a commander, you can stay 28 years on active duty. I was at 26. My sons and my daughter had all graduated, and they had moved here to West Michigan, which is where we're from. My daughter went to Michigan State University. Michigan State, very interestingly, offers in-state tuition for veterans. So since I was living in Great Lakes, I was very fortunate that she decided not to go to a private school like my sons did. And so it was much more affordable to do that. And so our family had all moved to West Michigan. My wife had served a career as a psychiatric nurse. She had a very successful career. And my family was over here. So I had decided that 26 years was enough. I mean, it would have been financially advantageous to stay two more. The Navy gives you 2.5% more for every year you serve past 20. So you can calculate that out. As a commander, that's pretty substantial amount of money, but at that time you weigh your family needs. My family had put up with enough. When I was in Japan during 9/11, as I described, one of the hardest experiences I had was when my son said to me, "Dad, can't they send another chaplain this time?" And that really broke my heart because I had told him that he was a man of the family, so he took that literally. Sometimes he had trouble sleeping because he felt he had to watch over his mother. And so I think my family had paid enough dues at that time, so we were happy to leave the Navy at that time on honorable conditions and move back to West Michigan and work with veterans here, which I do currently. It's interesting that both my sons went to seminary as well, are both ministers, but I don't think they're thinking about joining the military, at least right now, even though they're very qualified, because they did not like moving around as much as we did. Although I think we moved less in Great Lakes than most ministers, so I think they had it pretty good.
Yeah, because an awful lot of their denominations were every 5 years or someplace else.
Yes.
So kind of.
So in 2018, we transitioned back here and are happy, although Grand Rapids has changed a lot in the last 27 years. I don't even hardly recognize it. My sons had to re-educate me about what it's like. And currently, I still work with veterans. I work with PTSD support groups. I do education in my church. I do groups on post-traumatic stress disorder and what that involves, because I don't think the church, the Christian church in particular, does much with veterans other than maybe have them stand up at Veterans Day. I think since 22 veterans suicide every day, I think it's a issue that the church has long not done much with, so I'm trying to do more with it. I have done seminars at my church and look to do one. I did one on PTSD last year around Veterans Day, and this year I think I'm looking at doing one with moral injury, as we discussed a while back.
Yeah, well, explain a little bit what moral injury is, or how that's distinguished from what we think of as PTSD.
Well, the way I see it, I know there are several books on moral injury if people are more interested in it, but it's basically when you observe something that is not right with your moral conscience. Like, I've talked to Vietnam soldiers who were ordered to take out civilians, and they were in trouble if they didn't. Or I saw a Marine in Beaufort who murdered another Marine just out of jealousy. Those are things that spark your conscience that they're not morally right. It happens often in combat, but it happens in civilian life too, where you see things that are just affect your conscience, and it affects who you are as a moral person and were raised to be. And when you have things that violate that really affects your conscience and can change you permanently, because people often I talk to have second guess their decisions that they made in combat, that they were asked or forced to do that they did not feel was right. In some cases, they had moral courage to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do that. Or in some cases, they just followed orders. And so that's something you have to live with in your life. And so there are after effects that can affect your family with trust and other issues that go right into your very being and into your family relationship.
Yeah, and I guess it's one of the things that I learned about this, and some of it from Kaiser, who was a longtime Army chaplain and a friend of both of ours, was that with moral injury, in a way, the effect is often depression, but if it's viewed as PTSD, you can medicate. If you medicate PTSD, if PTSD has automatic reactions to things like hearing a loud noise and jumping, you give them basically depressants or things to quiet them down.
Sure.
If you give that to somebody with moral injury who's already depressed, that can be exactly the worst thing to do.
Right. So the VA uses cognitive processing therapy. That's a popular therapy that's used with PTSD patients and people with moral injury, and with some success. People can talk through it, but having a traumatic experience is kind of like eating a double cheeseburger. It sticks in your gut, and it takes time to digest it. And sometimes you never do completely, and you live with it for the rest of your life. And so, but talking about it helps. It does.
Yeah. Sometimes even doing interviews helps.
That's right.
So if I've talked to a lot of people who have PTSD, and if it's not going to help, they're not talking to me. But just being able to work your way through it, you get some level of control over the thing. Okay?
Sure.
Now, if you look back at the time that you spent in the military, overall, what do you think you took out of that, or how did that affect you?
Well, I think having been a boy who grew up in West Michigan, it has a very particular mindset, as you know, from having been transplanted here. I think it's very valuable to realize and experience different cultures around the world, to be sensitive to what's going on in the world, not just what's going on in West Michigan. So my children also have that view. My children appreciate other cultures. My son makes Thai food and Chinese food, and we have a very international. Fortunately, Calvin is becoming more international in their seminary. So many of our friends are from different nations, and being culturally aware of what's going on around the world. That's what I take from being in the military. And what a unique experience. I would have had to have been very rich to visit all the countries that I visited, from Australia to Africa to the Middle East many, many times, to the Holy Land. Although I've been mostly in Asia, as I shared, not very much in Europe. The Army's bigger in Europe. Navy is bigger in the Asia area.
All right. Well, it makes for an interesting and an unusual story. So thank you very much for coming in and sharing it today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Smither.